thank you all for being here today. And Bob, thank you for that kind and colorful introduction. I'm going to have to take Bob around the United States with me so he can give me kind introductions like that. In the time we have this morning, this afternoon, I'm going to come back and talk a little bit about assisted suicide and euthanasia and that debate. But this morning, I want to focus just on the marriage question. And one of the reasons why I have ended up researching and writing about both of these questions is that they both seek to redefine intergenerational relationships. You know, how you define marriage and the family really will define that relationship between parent and child at the beginning of life. And whether or not you allow physicians to kill their patients will really define the parent-child relationship at the end of life. Beginning of life, it's what duties do parents have to children. End of life, it's what duties do children have to their elderly parents. And one of the things that you'll see running through both of these presentations is how institutions matter. Frequently in the United States, we only think in terms of individuals, individual rights, individual liberties, with an idea that consenting adults should do whatever consenting adults want to do, provided it doesn't cause any immediate, tangible harm to an innocent third party. And one of the problems of thinking this way is that it actually overlooks the importance of an institution like the family and how institutions work, and the importance that institutions perform for a society. If you have too individualistic of an outlook, you're going to gloss over some of the important things that institutions, societies, non-governmental bodies, you know, the richer array of what Tocqueville had called voluntary associations in civil society, the groups in between the individual and the state, what they do for a community. So this morning I'll focus on the marriage issue. And I know your country has already redefined marriage. Unfortunately, my country did that just a few weeks ago through the court. The people in my country didn't vote to redefine marriage. We had 5 unelected judges tell us that marriage had to be redefined, even though nothing in our Constitution required or authorized such a redefinition. It was, in our case, judicial activism, very much akin to Roe v. Wade, if you're familiar with the US Supreme Court case, which created a license to abortion throughout all 9 months of pregnancy. There was nothing in our Constitution that authorized that. That was also simply the result of judicial activism, of judges legislating from the bench, rather than the people or the legislators actually legislating. So something similar has happened. But it's important that we continue to understand the truth about marriage and that we continue to bear witness to the truth about marriage. Because just like in the abortion context, in the United States, we've never accepted Roe v. Wade as the last word. You know, our position in the States has been that the court got that case wrong, and the court got the humanity of the unborn child wrong. And so every January 22nd, which is the anniversary of Roe v. Wade, somewhere around 500,000 Americans go to our capital, Washington, D.C., for what's called the March for Life. It's the anniversary of a bad Supreme Court ruling, reminding the court that they got it wrong and bearing witness to the truth about the dignity of unborn children. And little by little, we're making progress in both reducing the rate of abortion, but also repealing Roe v. Wade. First, it was the Born Alive Infant Protection Act. Then it was the partial birth ban. Now it's a 20-week bill that's passed our House of Representatives, and it's currently being debated in our Senate. President Obama is unlikely to sign it, but depending on who wins this next presidential election could determine whether or not this bill becomes law. So in the same way, we've been thinking, and it's the central thesis of my latest book, Learn from the Lessons of the Pro-Life Movement. What have they done for 42 years now in the United States to not allow abortion to be uncontested? What have they done throughout a generation and a half now to say that the court got it wrong? And what can we learn from them so that we can do the same on the marriage issue? Because there is a truth about marriage. Our courts and your nation alike have both gotten that truth wrong. They've overruled the truth. That's where the title of the book comes from. And so as a result, people who believe the truth have to work for the future of marriage to restore the truth. And the first step in that is going to be understanding what it is and how to speak about it from a secular perspective. What I have found to be the case in the United States is that people of faith already know what the Bible says. They know the theology of marriage. They know what their church teaches. And sometimes they think that this is simply a matter for the church. Oh, this is what Christians believe, as if it's just a private belief, the way that baptism or bar mitzvah would be a private religious belief. That's not the case for marriage. Marriage is both a natural and a supernatural institution. Marriage is part of the order of creation, not just the order of redemption. And so marriage is something that's based on human nature for all human beings, not just the religious. And part of this is because all human beings are created male and female, and all children deserve both a mom and a dad. It's not just Christians that are created male and female, and it's not just Christian children who deserve a mom and a dad. So let me spell this out a little bit. And I'll start by saying I didn't follow the debate in New Zealand, so I don't know what the slogans were. But I imagine they were similar to the slogans that I heard last week in Australia and that we heard for a decade in the United States. And the main slogan was marriage equality. The idea here that if you're not in favor of redefining marriage to include same-sex couples, you're against equality. Now, this is a wonderful slogan because it fits on a bumper sticker. If you're using Twitter, you can put a hashtag in front of marriage equality. If you're on Facebook, you can put up that red equals sign that many young people used as their Facebook profile picture when the debates were taking place. But ultimately, it's a vacuous slogan because it says absolutely nothing. Everyone in this hall this morning is in favor of marriage equality, properly understood. We all want the government, we all want the law to treat all marriages in the same way. We want all marriages to be treated equally under the law. Our disagreement is what sort of a relationship is a marriage. That's why the first book that Bob mentioned, the book that I co-authored with a classmate and a professor of mine at Princeton, was titled, What is Marriage? Because it's only if you know what a marriage is, can you then know whether your law is respecting or violating marriage equality. Every marriage law draws a line between what is a marriage and what isn't a marriage. Even your new marriage law still draws a line. It says that certain relationships aren't marriages and certain relationships are marriages. The question is which line to draw and why. And to draw the right line, you have to know what a marital relationship is. There are lots of consenting adult relationships out there. Which ones are marital? So what we did in our book and what I do in this new book is I argue on the basis of natural law. So I'm looking at philosophy of human nature, and I'm looking at the social science that helps unveil the outcomes of either respecting or violating human nature. And I do this by taking a lesson from the Greek philosopher Aristotle. So 2,500 years ago, Aristotle taught us that you can analyze any type of a community by looking at three aspects of the community. He says, look at the acts that the community engages in, look at the goods that the community is oriented towards, and then look at the commitments that the community makes to each other, the norms that they live by. And I normally illustrate this with an academic community, a university, because normally I'm speaking to university students and they're experiencing this firsthand. Think about what happens at a university. You engage in academic actions. What are academic actions? They're the types of things like a professor will deliver a lecture while students will listen to the lecture and take notes. Professors write books and articles. Students read those books, they read those articles, they write term papers. Professors then grade the papers, students then discuss them during office hours, things like that. Those are the actions that make a university a university. You think about what are the goods that those actions are ordered towards. They're ordered towards the good of the truth, towards knowledge. Why do you go to university? It's to be educated, to eliminate ignorance and error from your life, and to come to know the truth about whatever topic it is that you're studying. And then lastly, this can explain the commitments that members of a university community make to one another. This is where things like the honor code things like not plagiarizing your papers, not cheating on your exams, citing all of your sources, using footnotes. Why do we engage in those actions, or in those commitments? Because they protect the action in its pursuit of truth. If you were plagiarizing your papers, if you were cheating, if you were violating academic honesty, you would actually be prohibiting the ability of that community to seek its good. And this is why whenever you hear about one of these climate scientists who plagiarized the data, who cooked the books, we view it as an offense not just in the political debate, but about an offense on the academic enterprise, the intellectual endeavor to begin with. If you can't trust your scholars and your academics, what's the point of having universities if it just becomes a machine for propaganda? And how do we distinguish between propaganda and real scholarship? It's partly based upon living out these commitments. Let me say the same analysis. Let me apply this same analysis to the marriage debate. Because we can look at the same three factors. Look at the actions that spouses engage in, look at the goods that spouses are ordered towards, and then look at the commitments that spouses make to one another. And we can understand why the marital relationship is distinct from other adult relationships. And so we argue that first, marriage is a comprehensive relationship, and it's comprehensive in those three forms. It's comprehensive in the act that spouses engage in, it's comprehensive in the goods that spouses seek, and it's comprehensive in the commitments that spouses make to each other. So first, it's comprehensive in that there's an act that unites spouses at all levels of their humanity. It unites them, a union of hearts, minds, and bodies. It unites them comprehensively, this marital action. It's then ordered towards a comprehensive good. It's not ordered to any discrete particular good, like passing the next test or winning the next football match. It's ordered towards the comprehensive good of creating new life and then raising new life to the stage of maturity. And then lastly, it calls for comprehensive commitments, a commitment throughout time, a comprehensive commitment of permanency, and then a comprehensive commitment at every moment in time, the commitment of exclusivity. Let me unpack this, and this is the densest, most difficult part of today's presentations. And the reason why is that each and every one of our grandparents simply took it for granted that marriage was the union of a man and a woman. We now have to defend and explain using philosophy and social science, which was simply common sense to all of our grandparents. And so it's kind of like explaining to someone why wheels are round if they deny the obvious. You have to go back to first principles and help them understand basic truths about human nature that otherwise we always had just assumed. So let me unpack this a little bit to kind of elucidate it more. So the first step of the argument was that there's a comprehensive action that unites a man and a woman at all levels of their humanity. And so the starting point here is to say, well, what does it mean to unite comprehensively with another person? How can you unite comprehensively? And the answer to that question is, well, you have to unite at every level of what it means to be a human being. Now, what does it mean to be a human being? We're not just ghosts and machines. You sometimes hear Enlightenment philosophers say that we're just a spirit or we're just an intellect. A human being is a mind-body composite. You could think of it as an ensouled body or an embodied soul. However you prefer, you can see that we're a unity of both body and soul. This is one reason why you think of certain bodily offenses. They're not just the destruction of property, right? If someone stabs you, if someone rapes you, it's not that they've hurt your property, it's that they've assaulted you because you are your body. Whereas if they damage your car or they break into your house, they've hurt your property, but they haven't hurt you, which is why we treat physical assault and rape much more seriously than we do property crimes. So the question here is, if you're going to unite at all levels of your humanity with another person, it's going to have to be both a union of hearts and minds. Ordinary friendships are unions of hearts and minds, but also have a bodily component. You don't ordinarily unite bodily with your ordinary friends. Right? That bodily union is what's distinctive of marriage. So then the question becomes, well, how can you unite bodily with another person? Because same-sex couples are going to claim we do unite bodily in our own way. Here's one way of thinking about how to unite bodily. What is it that makes each and every one of us one organism, one body? Why am I not just a clump of cells? Why am I not just a heap of tissue and body parts? Is that all of my various systems, all of my various organs, all of my various tissues are integrated, coordinating with each other for my continued existence. Take my heart. It's pumping blood throughout my body, and I'm complete as an individual with the respect of cardiac activity. Respiration. My lungs are taking that blood, they're oxygenating that blood, so then the heart can pump it everywhere through the circulatory system. Digestion. I'm digesting my breakfast as we speak. So are you. Locomotion. We each walked into here on our own, and when we have the morning tea break, we'll walk out of here on our own. So whether it's digestion, respiration, locomotion, circulation, you can think all of these various bodily systems, each and every one of us is complete as an individual, and all of these various bodily systems are integrating with one another for our continued existence. Now, there's one bodily system in which we're radically incomplete. Here's a bodily system that we each have half of an entire system. And none of us on our own can perform this function. Whereas we can each digest and respire, and our hearts can pump our blood as individuals. None of us can do this particular function on our own. And each of us is outfitted with half of a system. And I'm talking about reproduction here. So that when a man and a woman unite in that marital act, they truly form a single organism with respect to a single bodily function of procreation. When the Hebrew scriptures talk about the two becoming one flesh, they're not just speaking poetically or metaphorically. The two people are so in love, it's as if they become one flesh. The Hebrew Bible is actually revealing something that's true about our nature, at a physical and at a metaphysical nature. When a man and a woman unite in that marital action, they truly become one. And that marital unity is so great that 9 months later it might require a name. And so that begins to tell us something about what the marital action is ordered towards. The same act that unites a man and a woman as husband and wife can also make them mother and father. The love-making act is also the life-giving act. And so it tells us something about the institution of marriage. It's meant to unite a man and a woman as husband and wife, but also to make them mother and father, and to then unite them not only with each other, but also with any children that union produces. So what is the comprehensive good that marriage is ordered towards? It's ordered towards both the creation of new life and then the raising of that new life to participate in human goodness in all of its forms. Think about, what does it require of good spouses? They have to love each other and cooperate with each other and care for each other to such a great extent that they can then raise new human beings to appreciate human goodness in all of its rich arrays. Right? Good parents want their children to appreciate beauty and truth and friendship and holiness and knowledge and all of the various forms of human flourishing. If you're a good parent, you try to raise your child to embrace those while avoiding badness and human evils. I don't know if there's a more comprehensive activity that you could set your lives on, creating a new human life and then raising that human life. And then lastly, this can explain why marriage requires comprehensive commitments. First, marriage requires a comprehensive commitment throughout time. This is why spouses pledge, "Till death do us part." Right? You're not just uniting temporarily, the way that you might with a business partner. Right? You sign a 5-year business contract. You're not just uniting temporarily the way that you would with your roommate when you were in university. Imagine what it would be like if university roommates were "till death do you part." Right? Those sorts of consenting adult relationships don't require a permanent commitment. Marriage does, because it's comprehensive. Likewise, marriage calls for an exclusive commitment. And what type of exclusivity are we talking about? We're talking about sexual exclusivity, because it's that sexual act that transforms ordinary friendships into a marital relationship. Marriage doesn't call for intellectual exclusivity. So none of you are cheating on your spouse by attending this morning's lecture. That's not the type of exclusivity that marriage calls for, because it's not an intellectual act that's distinctive of marriage. Marriage calls for sexual exclusivity because it's that sexual act that makes you one flesh. So if you sleep with someone other than your spouse, you have violated the commitment of fidelity. The type of fidelity that marriage calls for, that comprehensive commitment, is to forsake all others. Traditional phrase from the traditional marriage vows. So we argue that this basic understanding of marriage isn't just the creation of Christianity or Judaism. This is a sound understanding about our human nature, created as bodily beings, created male and female. This is built into the order of creation, not just built into the order of redemption. And that's why we see something like this being articulated by Aristotle and Plato, the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, like Musonius Rufus. We see it in both Jewish, Christian, and aspects of Islamic theology. We see it in Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke and Immanuel Kant. We even see it in Eastern thinkers like Gandhi. So what this suggests is that marriage isn't the creation of any given philosophical tradition or theological tradition or political community. It's something based on human nature, and therefore many different political communities throughout human history have attempted to live it out. And up until the past decade, we've seen more or less every society has utilized the institution of marriage to unite male and female. All throughout the globe, all throughout human history, men and women were uniting as husbands and wives to give children moms and dads. And it's only within the past 10 to 15 years that people started to think that this was irrational and arbitrary and bigoted. Now, you could say that's fine. You've given us this philosophical explanation of what marriage is, but why does any of this matter? Particularly, why does it matter for the government? So let me move on to that question. If we've covered what marriage is, let me now explain a little bit about why marriage matters, and particularly, why does it matter for the government, for a political community? Because here's one way of thinking about this. The government's not in the baptism business. The government's not in the bar mitzvah business. The government doesn't baptize people. The government doesn't throw bar mitzvahs for people. Why is the government in the marriage business? And this again harkens back to the fact that marriage has both natural and supernatural components. It has both a secular and a sacred function, whereas baptism just is supernatural. It just has sacred components. The state's in the marriage business because of its natural secular functions. And it's that natural secular function that matters for all citizens, whether they're Christian or non-Christian, whether they're religious or not religious. Because all citizens need an institution that unites a man and a woman as husband and wife to be mother and father for the next generation. That's not a religious function, that's a secular function. Marriage, so understood, is based on an anthropological truth that men and women are distinct and complementary. It's based on a biological fact that reproduction requires both a man and a woman, and it's based on a social reality that children deserve both a mother and a father. Now, as a secular matter, whenever a child is born, a mother will always be close by. Normally, she'll be in the same room. That's a simple fact of biology. The question for culture, and thus the question for law, is will a father be close by? And if so, how long? Marriage is an institution that societies all across the globe and all throughout human history utilize to maximize the likelihood that that father commits to that mother, and then the two of them committed to each other commit to that child. Because when this doesn't happen, the social costs run high for the entire community. If you look at what happens when mothers and fathers either fail to unite in the first place, or when they disunite prematurely, when they come apart prematurely, look at the costs for those families, for those children, and for the community as a whole. It impacts everyone. Why does this matter? Because there's no such thing as parenting. There's both mothering and there's fathering. Moms and dads do complementary things for their children. Let me read you a quote from an American social scientist at Rutgers University, a research university in New Jersey. David Popenoe is the professor. He says he did a study of all of the existing literature that had explored parenting, and he said, quote, "The burden of social science evidence supports the idea that gender-differentiated parenting is important for human development, and the contribution of fathers to child rearing is unique and irreplaceable." He then concluded, "We should disavow the notion that mommies can make good daddies, just as we should disavow the popular notion that daddies can make good mommies. The two sexes are different to the core, and each is necessary culturally and biologically for the optimal development of a human being." End quote. What's the professor getting at? Let me try to illustrate what the professor was getting at with a thought experiment. If I tell you it's a Saturday morning and a 5-year-old boy is in the living room wrestling with one of his parents, and this parent is teaching the 5-year-old boy that it's okay to put people in headlocks, but it's not okay to pull hair or to bite or to gouge out eyes, which parent is most likely in the living room? And the laughter gives it away that you know that it's most likely the father. And now this isn't because we've engaged in some global conspiracy in which only dads can wrestle with their 5-year-old sons. It's that this is just what's come naturally to men. Men enjoy roughhousing in general, and fathers enjoy this rough and tumble play with their sons in particular. You see this as well as when a father is most likely to be tossing a newborn baby in the air, and a mother is more likely to be saying, "Honey, not so high." Because moms tend to be more nurturing. After carrying a child in their womb for 9 months, they tend to be the ones that are more nurturing, more comforting. They have that maternal care. And again, it's not because we've engaged in some global conspiracy of gender stereotypes, because the same behavior takes place in New Zealand, and exactly halfway around the globe in the United States, mothers and fathers are doing the same sorts of things. And it's not because we have taught them that they have to throw babies in the air or say "not so high" or wrestle. It's what comes by nature. Now, this continues throughout the child's development. The 10-year-old boy is likely to be, in the backyard or in a park tossing around a ball with his father. The 15-year-old boy, his father's helping him maybe tie a necktie and get ready for a high school dance. In all of these instances, we see fathers interacting with their sons to help them develop into young men. When you step back from the anecdotes, and the anecdotes meant to get you to laugh a little bit to show that we all kind of know this in our guts. Step back from the anecdote, we know from the social science that boys who grow up without their fathers, more likely to commit crime, less likely to graduate from school, more likely to spend time in jail, less likely to be employed. So there are consequences to those children and to society as a whole when that father is missing. And it's not just for boys. Fathers do something complementary for their daughters. Fathers, on average and for the most part, tend to be larger than mothers, a little bit taller, a little bit heavier, a little bit stronger than mothers. Fathers, on average and for the most part, tend to have deeper voices than mothers. fathers, on average and for the most part, tend to have once been young men. And so they know what the wrong sort of young man might be looking for in their daughter. And so fathers tend to be the ones that scare away bad boyfriends. Fathers tend to be the ones who police who's dating their daughter. Now, a father who's married to his daughter's mother also models what a good male-female relationship looks like. The father who gets married and stays married to his daughter's mother and treats her well shows his daughter what she might look for in a suitor, in a potential boyfriend, fiance, and husband. Now, when you step back from the anecdote, look at the data, we see that girls who grow up without their fathers, more likely to start sexual activity earlier in life, more likely to have to be pregnant outside of marriage, more likely to have an abortion. Because that father protects the space for his daughter to develop into a woman without prematurely engaging in adult activity. The father helps protect his daughter's innocence. Don't just take my word for this. Let me read you a quote, and then I'll ask you which right-wing nut job said this. It's an American, so you can start thinking, and the question I'm going to have for you is, which American social conservative extremist said the following? We know the statistics. Children who grow up without a father are 5 times more likely to live in poverty and commit crime, 9 times more likely to drop out of school, and 20 times more likely to end up in prison. They are more likely to have behavioral problems or run away from home or become teenage parents themselves. And the foundations of our community are weaker because of it. Who said that? President Obama, before he evolved. And the laughter gives me a chance to take a sip of water. That worked out perfectly. Why did President Obama say that? He explained why he spoke repeatedly before his evolution about the importance of fathers when he gave a commencement address at a historically black all-male college in the United States. He said the following: I have tried to be for Michelle and my girls what my father was not for my mother and me. I want to break that cycle. So President Obama knows firsthand what it was like growing up without a father. And that's what's inspiring him to be a good husband to Michelle and a good father to his 2 daughters. So immediately that should remind us that just because you grow up outside of a traditional family doesn't mean you're somehow destined for failure in life. President Obama has clearly lived a successful life. He's married, he has children, he's been elected twice to the President of the United States. But President Obama would be the first to tell you that he had a tougher road in life because his father wasn't there. So on the one hand, we shouldn't overstate the problem and make it seem like if you grow up with a single mom, you're somehow destined to fail in life. But on the other hand, we shouldn't gloss over family structure as if it's unimportant. We can say that family structure matters the way that Obama does, without therefore demonizing children who are in alternative family arrangements, nor demonizing single moms. Frequently, it's these single mothers who are the heroes of these stories. When the father abandoned the family, or when the boyfriend abandoned the family and abandoned the child, it was that mother who actually took responsibility, and frequently in a heroic fashion. But both the child and the mother, more likely than not, would say, I wish that man would have man up. I wish he would have done right by me and by the children. So we also don't want to ignore the fact that family structure matters. And why does it matter? Here's what we found in the United States. The communities where marriage has either failed to form in the first place or where it's fallen apart prematurely, that's where we see the rise of child poverty and the decrease in social mobility. That's where we see the rise in crime, the increase in the prison population, the decrease in graduation rates, and the decrease in employment rates. So everything that you could care about if you care about social justice, if you care about the poor, if you care about combating poverty, And if you care about limited government and freedom, because we also see that that's when the prisons grow and the welfare state explodes. So if you're a small government person, if you're a limited government person, and you care about the poor, you have to care about marriage. Because where marriages fall apart, government grows, and human beings fail to flourish. This is why the state's in the marriage business. Not because it's a sacrament or a covenant or a religious institution. Not because it cares about consenting adult romance simply for the sake of being a sucker for romance. The state's in the marriage business because the union of a man and a woman can produce a child, and those children deserve both a mom and a dad. Which then leads to the last question that I'll answer before my time expires. Well, what will the consequences be of redefining marriage? The second part of today's title was about the future of marriage. What can we expect to happen to marriage if we don't do anything to combat it? So these 4 consequences that I'm going to describe simply follow as a logical matter once you get rid of the male-female part. Whether or not they actually take place will depend on what people like you and me do. If we're successful, hopefully we can prevent these things from taking place. If we're unsuccessful, this is where the logic leads. And so it's important to understand where the logic leads. And here's the basic framework for all 4 of these consequences. Ideas have consequences, and bad ideas have bad consequences. The law will now teach that marriage is about consenting adult romance of whatever size or shape the consenting adults come in. The law used to teach that marriage is about a permanent, exclusive union of a man and a woman because children deserve moms and dads. The law can't teach both things at the same time. And what happens is that the law shapes our culture. Our culture then shapes our beliefs and our children's beliefs and our grandchildren's beliefs. And then those beliefs shape our actions. And so you will either come to believe that marriage is about a permanent, exclusive, monogamous union of sexually complementary spouses because kids need moms and dads, and then you'll live that out in your life, or you'll come to believe that marriage is about consenting adult romance of whatever size or shape the consenting adults most desire. And this isn't something that gays and lesbians are to blame for. The legal redefinition of marriage can only take place when and where it does after 40 or 50 years of a cultural redefinition of marriage. Same-sex marriage is a symptom of a much larger problem. And that larger problem is that heterosexuals bought into a bad liberal ideology that said consent is the only thing that matters. And so what have we seen heterosexuals do to marriage during the past 40 years? With the rise of the hookup culture and the use of pornography and the rise of premarital sex and non-marital childbearing and the increase in adultery and the high rates of divorce. It's only after a cultural redefinition of marriage that a legal redefinition of marriage even seems plausible. 50 years ago, no one would have even thought that same-sex marriage was a possibility because the lived experience of marriage simply didn't allow for it. But after heterosexuals make a mess of human sexuality and the family, it seems like a logical next step. The problem is that it's a logical next step of a bad train of logic. If you think that the sexual revolution and the values that it embodies, the hookup culture, single parenting, no-fault divorce, if you think these things have been good for human flourishing, then by all means, continue down that road with the next step of redefining what marriage is. But if you think that those things have been bad for human flourishing, why would you want to legally enshrine them in your law? And that's what has recently taken place, both in the United States and in New Zealand. So let me go through these 4 consequences one by one, and you'll see they all follow this general framework. The first consequence is we now have no institution left in society that upholds even the ideal that every child deserves both a mother and a father. In fact, to say that a child deserves both a mom and a dad will increasingly be seen as hate speech. Because the message that same-sex marriage sends is that men and women are interchangeable, and therefore mothers and fathers are replaceable. That 2 moms or 2 dads is the same thing as a married mom and a dad. And as I mentioned, gays and lesbians aren't to blame for the breakdown of the marriage culture. Heterosexuals are. But same-sex marriage will make it this much more difficult to rebuild a marriage culture. In the United States right now, 40% of all children are born to single mothers. In the minority communities, it's even more. It's 50% of Hispanics and 70% of African Americans are born to single moms. How do we as a society insist that those fathers are essential when Anthony Kennedy and the 4 liberal judges on the Supreme Court have now redefined marriage to make fathers optional? You can't simultaneously say fathers are essential and have your law say they're optional. That's the first consequence of redefining marriage, and it's one of the possible futures for marriage if we don't do something to stop it. Second consequence is that the redefinition of marriage won't stop here. And the best way to illustrate this is to simply introduce you to 3 new words that activists and scholars in the United States have developed to describe where they would like to see marriage go next. The first is the term throuple. A throuple is a 3-person couple. Take the word couple, chop off the C, and then add a THR. Throuple. The idea here, this was in New York Magazine. New York Magazine is a prominent publication in New York City. And what happens in New York City today will be exported to the rest of the world in the decades to come. A throuple that they were profiling, it was 3 men who live with each other and love each other. They sleep with each other. They cook meals for each other. They do grocery shopping for one another. They want to visit each other in the hospital. They want to have a joint bank account. They want to file joint tax returns. They want to inherit each other's wealth should one of them pass away. On the marriage equality vision, where love equals love, they have a marriage. It's consenting adult romance and caregiving. And so if you sue at the US Supreme Court, for example, for marriage equality for the same-sex couple, on what logical basis could you deny marriage equality to a same-sex throuple? Or for that matter, to an opposite-sex quartet? Because sexuality here, whether it's heterosexual or homosexuality, doesn't make a difference. You can have a heterosexual throuple, 2 men and 1 woman, or 2 women and 1 man. Or you can have a quartet, 2 men and 2 women, an ensemble. It's not polygamy, it's polyamory. It's group marriage. And the question here, if love equals love, why can't you add 1 more equals sign and say love equals love equals love? And that the 3-person throuple is equal to the 2-person couple. The way that we arrived at monogamy in Western law and culture is that it's 1 man and 1 woman who can unite in that marital act that unites them as husband and wife, and that also then creates new human life. And every new human life has 1 mother and 1 father. And so marriage was about uniting those people in a stable, permanent, monogamous relationship. But once you say the male-female part of marriage is irrational and arbitrary and bigoted, what's your justification for monogamy? What's magical about the number 2 once you say it's irrational to think sexual complementarity matters? The next term is the term monogamish. This was in the New York Times Sunday magazine. It was a profile of the most prominent gay rights activist in America, Dan Savage. The reporter asked him a question: what can straight couples learn from gay couples? And his response was, they can learn the virtue of the monogamish relationship, a two-person relationship that's sexually open. He said that the problem with the way straight people do marriage is that they expect sexual fidelity. They expect sexual exclusivity. And that it would be much better if they practice marriage without coercion or deceit. So you're open and honest about it. You should be free to sleep with multiple partners. That you're married to one of them and you love that one and you care for that one, but you can seek out sexual fulfillment with other people. And again, if marriage is just about consenting adult romance, why can't you consent to have an open relationship? Lastly, the term wed lease. This was in the Washington Post. This is a play on the word wedlock. If wedlock conjures up an image of something strong, sturdy, permanent, wed lease is the opposite. Just like you can lease a car or lease a house, here was a lawyer saying that you can lease your spouse. He was arguing for a temporary marriage license, a 5-year marriage contract which you could renew on good behavior. If it's going well, you can renew your wed lease. If it's not going well, it simply automatically dissolves. Just like when you lease a car, you don't lease it for life, you lease it for a certain time period. And again, if marriage is just consenting adult romance, why does it have to be permanent? What requires permanency if it's just about your adult love life? Whatever you might think about the theology or the morality of thruples and wed leases and monogamish relationships, think about the social costs. What we know is that the more sexual partners men and women have and the less commitment they make to each other, the more likely they create children with multiple people to whom they are not committed. So the thruple, the wed lease, the monogamish relationship, they increase the number of fatherless children. They increase the number of fragmented families. They directly undercut the public purpose of marriage. And yet, as a logical matter, each and every one of these further redefinitions follows once you say the male-female procreation, mother-fathering part of marriage is irrational and bigoted. Let me move on to the third consequence. The third consequence is for unborn children. And the best way of thinking about this is that if you redefine marriage, you redefine parenting. And if you redefine parenting, you will redefine childhood and the creation of children. And I'll go through this quickly because I know this afternoon we have a presentation on surrogacy. But what we have seen is that with the redefinition of marriage, same-sex couples desire, quote, children of our own. And how will a same-sex couple acquire a child? Frequently, they will turn to assisted reproductive technology. A same-sex gay couple will have to use someone else's eggs, someone else's womb. The same-sex lesbian couple, they can use one of their eggs, one of their wombs, and then have a sperm donor. What are the consequences? I'll just mention 3 briefly. 1, the risk for exploitation of poor women. Many Americans, whether they're straight or gay, many Americans who use commercial surrogacy frequently are using a poor woman in a third world country to rent out her womb. Not very many wealthy women choose to rent out their wombs and be a surrogate mother. It tends to be poor women who are exploited. And again, this cuts both ways, whether heterosexual or homosexual. Second consequence is for unborn human life. What we know about the assisted reproductive technology industry is that they create many more embryos than are ever implanted or that are delivered. And so many of these embryos are destroyed or they spend their lives in a freezer. So if you care about the sanctity of human life, you have to care about how human life is created and then destroyed. Lastly, when assisted reproductive technologies are used in the same-sex marriage context, here you have a child being created at the very moment of conception to be denied either a mother or a father. One child who's now an adult was raised by lesbian moms in the United States said that same-sex marriage creates an institution for missing parents. We all recognize that we're fallen. We're frail, we're weak, we don't live up to our ideals. But single parenting and divorce are no one's ideal. No one incentivizes and encourages people to become single parents or to get divorced. We recognize sometimes those are necessary because we fail. But with same-sex marriage, you actually are creating an institution to create children to then be deprived of either a mother or a father. And in the minute that I have left, I'll just go through the fourth consequence, which is for religious freedom. And the basic idea here is that if your law teaches this generation and the next generation and subsequent generations that marriage is a genderless institution and that people who think it's a gendered institution are bigots, over time the law will treat those people as bigots. It might not happen overnight, and so in your country's case, it's only been a year or two since marriage has been redefined. But over time, the law will teach people who believe marriage is the union of a man and a woman are irrational, arbitrary, hateful, bigoted, homophobic, fill in the blank. You've heard all of these words used to describe people who believe the truth about marriage. In the United States, this has been playing out immediately. We've seen in the states that have redefined marriage, Christian adoption agencies have been forced to stop taking care of children because they wanted to find the orphans entrusted to their care homes with moms and dads, and the government said that's discrimination. The government said, unless you treat the married same-sex couple in the same exact way as you treat the married mother and father, you're not respecting marriage equality. You have to treat all marriages equally. The Christian Adoption Agency said, look, we think kids deserve a mom and a dad. Our religion teaches us that they deserve a mom and a dad. And what about the First Amendment to the US Constitution? Doesn't it protect religious freedom? And the answer is that it doesn't protect bigotry. It doesn't protect discrimination. You're discriminating. You can't run a discriminatory adoption agency. It hasn't just been charities, it's also been businesses. We've seen florists and photographers and bakers, people who believe the truth about marriage, simply wanting to run their businesses in accordance with their beliefs, and they've been penalized by the government. In one case, there was an evangelical couple who ran a bakery. They were asked by a lesbian couple to bake a same-sex wedding cake. They politely said no. They were fined $135,000 because of that. They were forced to shut down their bakery. The husband is now working as a trash collector. In none of these cases did we have a couple that said, we refuse to serve gays and lesbians. Their only objection was to the same-sex wedding. They had no problem baking a happy birthday cake for a gay customer, doing a get-well-soon bouquet of flowers for a lesbian customer. They simply didn't want the government to tell them to use their God-given artistic gifts to help celebrate what they thought violated God's intentions for marriage. And yet, so far, they've lost all of these court cases, and they've been penalized. So I'll just close here, and then I'm happy to do questions this afternoon, so text those in to the number. But I'll just close by saying nothing in human life is destined one way or the other. It all depends on what human beings do. And so when you hear people say, oh, you're on the wrong side of history, or oh, this is inevitable, that's a way of trying to discourage you from doing anything. And in the United States, the way this played out was that people were simply intimidated and bullied into silence. And that's why we're getting these bad consequences. It's really going to be up to you in your nation to bear witness to the truth, to help your neighbors understand the truth about marriage, what it is, and why it matters. And I hope that this morning's presentation is helpful for that end, and I'm happy to do whatever I can this afternoon to answer additional questions. Thank you.
How do you respond to those who question the natural definition of marriage on the basis of infertile couples' right to marriage? And similar vein, if marriage is about having babies, what about allowing old couples to marry?
Yeah, great question.
Thank you. Oh, sorry, wasn't mine.
Okay, let me give you a couple of ways of thinking about this. If you remember from this morning, I said there was one question of what is marriage, and then a second question of why does it matter, and why does the government care about marriage? If every marriage was infertile, the government wouldn't care about marriage. So if no marriage ever produced a child, we wouldn't have the state in the marriage business. But not every marriage produces a child. Every child is the fruit of a male-female relationship. And so the government's in the marriage business to try to get men and women to commit to each other permanently and exclusively so that any children that are created have a mom and a dad. And doing this, recognizing marriage between men and women, even infertile couples, doesn't come with any costs. So an infertile couple that gets married doesn't send a signal that moms and dads are interchangeable or that two moms or two dads is the same thing as a mom and a dad. Furthermore, it's highly unlikely for both spouses to be infertile. So even in this case, it still advances the state's interest. So let's say it's an elderly couple where the wife is clearly past menopause, so she won't be bearing any children. If her husband is faithful to her, he's not creating children with some other woman. And so again, it's still advancing the state's interest. But we can take one step further back and say that the state's interest in marriage doesn't define what marriage itself is. The first part of my presentation this morning said that marriage is about a comprehensive union. It's a union in which a man and a woman unite as one flesh. And that takes place regardless of whether or not 24 hours later a sperm fertilizes an egg, and regardless of whether 9 months later a child is born. What's necessary for one flesh union is the marital action that unites a man and a woman as husband and wife. The reason the government cares is because that same action in the majority of marriages also makes husband and wife mother and father. So it requires an understanding of kind of like the state's in the wholesale, not the retail business, so that your legislation is always about the rule, not the exception to the rule as to why marriage matters. But an infertile marriage is still a marriage, which is why infertility has never been grounds for annulment. Much to King Henry's displeasure, infertility has never been grounds for annulment, whereas impotency has in both civil law, common law, and canon law. An impotent individual was unable to consummate a marriage, and a non-consummated marriage was always eligible for annulment.
Do you have evidence that children of same-sex marriages suffer mentally or socially?
Great question. You're doing a good job asking great questions. Yes. Chapter 7 of my new book goes through all of the social science on this question because there's a lot of controversy.
That book's actually for sale out
the book is on sale outside. And
special price.
Bob gets $5 of that 25. I get 5 cents. We worked out a deal. But it takes an entire chapter, and it's about a 30-some page chapter because there's been lots of debates on this social science. And so this will take maybe 2 or 3 minutes to answer. What we do know is that there was about a 40-year consensus of social scientists on the importance of marriage for children. There had been these debates coming out of the 1960s saying single parenting, divorce, the kids will be just fine. And then the social scientists actually looked at the data and they're like, we were wrong. Normally, the way you get academics to change their minds is that old academics die and the newer professors come into the academies, and that's how you achieve academic change. This was actually a situation in which professors were willing to say, I was wrong when I said X, it's actually Y. And so there was a more or less a consensus of liberals and conservatives, of secularists and religious people saying marriage matters, children do best with their married mother and father. And then the question of gay marriage came up. And all of a sudden it splintered that consensus. There were some scientists who continued to say, no, the married biological mother and father still matter. And there were other people saying, oh, no, it's just 2 adults. What children need are 2 adults. The first group of scientists says that doesn't make any sense because we know that cohabitation isn't good for children and they're 2 adults in cohabiting relationships. And we know that divorce and remarriage aren't good for children. They're 2 adults in those relationships. So why is the missing father a problem for all of these other family relationships, but it's somehow not going to be a problem for 2 lesbian moms raising a child? It simply didn't make sense to these scientists. Nevertheless, the American Psychological Association, the American Psychiatric Association, various professional associations came out and said there was no difference between same-sex parenting and opposite-sex parenting. And they filed amicus briefs, they issued reports, and then 3 years ago, a professor at Louisiana State University actually did an audit of all 59 studies that the APA relied on when it came to its conclusion that there was no difference. And he found not a single one of them used a large random representative sample. Not a single one of the studies that the media kept promoting, saying there's no difference between same-sex and opposite-sex parenting, that even the academic professional associations were using to justify their political and legal advocacy, not a single one met the standard of excellence for social science. If you don't have a random representative sample, you can't draw representative conclusions. So if I told you that we did a study of single parents and all of the single parents were college-educated, wealthy, white women living in New York City and San Francisco, you wouldn't be surprised if those children turned out better on average than the average child. Because the average child doesn't have a college-educated, wealthy, elite mother living in an urban area. The same thing was true of these studies of same-sex parenting. The average respondent was a double-income, double-college graduate, white lesbian living in San Francisco or New York City. That's not representative of same-sex parenting on average. We now have, there are 8 studies now that have used large random representative sampling that includes same-sex couples that are parenting, and they come to the same exact conclusion as that 40-year consensus of social science. The best place for a child is with a married mother and father. And the reason why, the social scientists suggest, are 3, that biology matters, gender matters, and stability matters. And that the same-sex parenting environment, there won't be a double biological connection. At best, one parent will be a biological parent and the other parent will be a step parent or an adoptive parent. So it'll be very similar to those sorts of households. There won't be gender duality parenting. There'll be 2 moms, 2 dads, but not both a mom and a dad. So already we know the same-sex parenting households have 2 strikes against them, the biology and the gender. The last thing we know is that stability matters, that every transition a child is forced to go through produces poorer outcomes. That's why cohabitation and divorce are bad for children, because those are transitions that are disruptive. So far, what we know about same-sex relationships is that they're not particularly stable. And this has nothing to do with homosexuality. It has to do with gender pairings. A male-female relationship can be more stable because it can counteract the best and the worst of each gender. The double male and the double female tend to exacerbate the best or the worst. So, for example, the double male relationship tends to be the most promiscuous. Not because gay men are promiscuous, it's because men are promiscuous. And when you have 2 men in a relationship, it tends to accentuate the natural promiscuity of males. And so the instability that gay male relationships have is that they tend to be sexually open. Remember when I mentioned the word monogamish? That was a gay activist saying, here's what straight people can learn from gay people. It's not surprising it was a gay male. 2 women tend to have the shortest lived relationships. And again, this has nothing to do with homosexuality, it has to do with women. Women tend to be the ones that file for the vast majority of divorces. Somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of divorces. The reason why is that while women are better at relationships, they also have a much higher threshold of emotional satisfaction. It's very rare that you hear a guy say, I broke up with my girlfriend because my emotional needs weren't being met. And the laughter suggests that you have heard women say those things. So when you have a double female relationship, it tends, on average and for the most part, to exacerbate those outcomes. And so it tends to be less stable. So again, you can look at double male, double female, male, female, and they tend to manifest themselves in different ways because men and women are different. And so that tends to suggest that they won't be as stable as the married mother-father relationship. So if the 3 things that explain why marriage matters for children, biology, gender, and stability, aren't present in same-sex relationships, there's good reason to think that these first 8 social science studies that used random and representative samples will be replicated. But the social science is still in its infancy, but so far it seems to be consistent.
What allows you to stand in such a contentious or aggressive environment without becoming emotional, hurt, disenchanted? What can you say to encourage us to enter into the same environment?
A couple of thoughts. One is that in my case, it's simply that all of my previous background prepared me well for this. I went to a very, very liberal Quaker school in Baltimore where I grew up. And so from 1st grade through 12th grade, I was one of the only center-right individuals. I was only one of the only theists in the class, one of the only conservatives, one of the only people that liked Ronald Reagan or George W. Bush. Actually, not George H.W. Bush from when I was a student in grade school. Then I went to Princeton, and so that was when George W. Bush was president. And the same things, Princeton's a secular, liberal, Ivy League school. So I was used to somewhat being in the minority and defending myself. I also have 4 brothers, and so if you've ever seen the Piers Morgan interview that Bob mentioned when he introduced me, that was called dinner in my household. That's just how we debated things. So I was used to, contentious situations, and so I got used to it. The other nice thing about Princeton is that there was a critical mass of serious conservatives, intellectual Christians, people who would think about these sorts of issues. And so even though we were the minority on campus, and I would say we were somewhere between 10 and 20% of the campus, 10 or 20% is actually a sizable minority. And there was comfort in numbers. We could discuss things amongst ourselves. We could engage our liberal secular classmates. There was one really good professor there, Robbie George, who I ended up co-authoring a book with, who could mentor us and give us insights in that, how do you engage in a secular liberal environment and succeed. The last thing I'll say is that there is a certain serenity that comes with knowing that you don't have to succeed, that your vocation in life is to bear witness to the truth, and that what God asks, that ultimately what God asks of each of us is to be faithful, not to be successful. And so, the Supreme Court did what it wanted to do several weeks ago. I did my best to persuade them not to do that in both times. 2 years ago when I was at the Supreme Court, and then 2 months ago when I was at the Supreme Court, the dissenting justices cited research that I had written. Sure, it would have been better had they cited it in a majority opinion instead of a dissenting opinion. But at the end of the day, what we're asked to do is to do our part. And whether you're an academic, a scholar, an activist, a physician, a pastor, a business person, a family person, a stay-at-home mom, a stay-at-home dad, a teacher, whatever your role is, each of us has a unique thing to contribute. And it could be the intellectual arguments, it could be the manpower, it could be the financial support, it could be the professional experience, it could be the testimonies. Those testimonies that we heard before lunch were incredibly moving. So whatever our particular role is, we're just asked to do it regardless of the outcomes.
What practical actions should we take to make a difference in respect to these issues? What should be our response? So perhaps, Greg, you could start, and just in the 2 areas that you've talked about, and then Peter, in your area, what are you challenging us to do? I mean, we can go away and say it was a great feed and you guys spoke well and etc. But what do you want us to do from here?
So I agree with everything that's been said so far, so there's not that much more to add. So mainly it'll just be by way of echoing. Bob told me that I had to say in response to this last question that what you're supposed to do is buy the book, because he wants to sell all of his copies, but you got yours. That's somewhat facetious, but it's also meant to be, do your homework. Have you noticed that sometimes you see that people who share our beliefs, when they're defending them, don't always do a good job? So if you do want to be able to speak out, and I echo the previous 2 speakers in wanting to encourage you to speak out in whatever domain you're best equipped for, whether that's talking to your family members, your coworkers, your neighbors, but put in the time, do your homework ahead of time so you know what to say. So the reason that people like us give the talks we give and write the articles and the books we write is to help equip people on how do I then say these things. The book that I've written was meant to help people in America, but it's just as applicable in New Zealand. Ordinary people who don't have time, PhDs, fancy degrees to write all this stuff, to read it and then be able to better understand how to answer a question about the social science. Each and every one of you should be able to give that answer that I just gave about the social science if you put in the time to do the homework. It's chapter 7 of my book. You can read it. You can find it also online, though. So the thing is, this isn't ultimately to get my nickel On the euthanasia piece, hopefully, Bob, the talk that I gave today was based on a report that I wrote for the Heritage Foundation. You can get it for free on the internet. Just Google my name, Ryan Anderson, and then the title, Always Care, Never Kill. And Bob hopefully can circulate the link or link to it on the Family First website. It's about a 20-page report that more or less goes through everything I said this afternoon. So you could read it yourself more leisurely, slowly, and know the facts and figures. So that would be part one, do your homework. I would then say part two, live out the truth. I think one of the things that Pope Benedict is most famous for is saying that, you know, the arguments of the philosophers and the theologians are important. And remember, he's a world-class theologian himself. But he said, ultimately, it's the lives of the saints that win converts. That the church's best evangelists aren't the intellectuals, the scholars with the pointy heads who write these books. It's the ordinary people who are holy. And it's that lived experience of holiness that ultimately wins over people. I would say on both of the issues that I spoke to, whether it's the end-of-life debate or the beginning of life, if we had more people simply living out the truth. So if you're a spouse, be a good husband, be a good wife. If you're a parent, take your responsibilities to your children seriously. If you're now a middle-aged child, take your responsibilities to your parents seriously. If you have a sick or an elderly member of your family or your community, make sure you're helping them not to feel hopeless and alone. You know, these are the kind of battlefields in everyday life where holiness is lived out. It's how you take care of your spouse, how you take care of your children, how you now take care of your elderly parents and grandparents. And if the Christian witness was stronger, right? If more people were encountering that holiness, they wouldn't be tempted to other alternatives. They would say, I want what they have, that holy family. I want that for me and my family. And you'll inspire them by your example. I mean, it's an apocryphal quote. It's attributed to St. Francis of Assisi, but apparently he never said it. But the quote is, preach the gospel at all times, and if necessary, use words. Whoever said that was onto something. Right? There's a time to use words, but there's also a time to let your actions speak for themselves. And so I would just say that's what you can do. It's what all of us can do in all of our various walks of life.